Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Dean, Mr. Vice Chancellor, Mr. Dean, faculty, colleagues, student friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure being here this evening with all of you. This must be the 5th time that I've found myself delivering a Kunzru lecture, and it's always an extremely challenging thing to do. One of the reasons is that the theme that is selected every year is so different that sort of, one has to always put one's thinking cap on and think about what one has to say. And that is what, in a way, I will be doing today as well. So this is, and please take it to be, not just in a way an inaugural talk for the series of lectures, but also in some ways very exploratory. And what I'm going to do in this lecture, I think I should be upfront about this and tell you. My lecture is not going to be about social movements per se. And the reason is that we're going to have several lectures that are going to be precisely on that. So I don't want this lecture to be, I didn't want this lecture to be one where I was just giving you a list of social movements and examples. The other thing that I want to specify right at the outset is this is not a lecture on international relations either, in terms of just talking about IR. So right there I've disposed of the two main sort of, elements in the title of this lecture. And it's not even really about the impact of social movements in world affairs, which was very tempting, but I thought that, it's not even about the intersection of social movements and international relations. I wanted to focus on this, about how international relations as an academic discipline has dealt with social movements and what needs to change. So there's a lot that I'm not going to be covering in this lecture, and I want to be very upfront about this. Many of these things issues that I'm not covering will be covered in subsequent lectures in some form or the other. I want to reflect on the academic discipline itself. I want to ask how this discipline has dealt with social movements. I want to ask really what, if anything, needs to change. And I can tell you this really upfront, my sense is that, in fact, a lot needs to change. I don't believe that international relations as an academic discipline has really seriously grappled with the question of social movements. And that's one of the things that I will, with all of you, explore this evening. So how am I organizing this lecture then? I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining social movements, because I have to. But they're going to be very standard, easy to get hold of definitions. But I'll just, play them out with you. I'll then sort of talk a bit about how we can categorize knowledge in international relations. International relations is a body of knowledge. If we were to try to categorize and classify it, what are the ways in which we could do so? And how could we do it in a manner that makes sense? I'm then going to analyze, well, what is the bulk of the theme, which is how international relations actually views social movements. And finally, I will be so bold as to suggest a research agenda for the future, about 5 agenda points that I think, as a community of scholars, we really, I think, need to think about in terms of not only getting some sense of social movements, but also in a way revitalizing international relations as an academic discipline. So what are social movements then? I mean, social movements are a type of group action. They're a type of group action that involves either large informal groupings of individuals, sometimes organizations. They have a focus on specific political and social issues in order to carry out, resist, or undo social change. So it's important to understand that. Social change, as I will sort of repeat several times over the next few minutes, is at the heart of social movements. But it's not necessarily always in favor of social change. They are collective activities designed to bring about or resist primary changes in an existing society or group. Typically, social movements are loosely organized, but they are sustained collective campaigns in support of a social goal. And as Sidney Tarrow has sort of, quite intriguingly defined it, collective challenges by people with common purposes and solidarity to elites, authorities, other groups, and cultural codes in sustained interactions with them. Several elements in this definition are important. They are collective challenges, first of all. There must be a sense of common purpose and solidarity that brings people in a social movement together. There must be some form of a challenge to those in power, elites, authorities, other groups, cultural codes but it must be in a sustained manner. That's the other thing. That is in fact one of the critical elements in social movements. Something that distinguishes a social movement from an agitation or a mob. That is the thing, that it is able to sustain itself. Charles Tilly brings on a kind of a more performative kind of definition. He defines this as a series of contentious performances, displays, and campaigns by which ordinary people make collective claims on others. So out here, for Tilly, social movements are always about performance as well. It's not just about certain claims, not just about certain form of organization. It's also about a certain performative aspect. And it's about making claims. The interesting thing about all of these definitions, and they're all very standard definitions. You can go to any encyclopedia in the social sciences, and you'll find some variation of these definitions, because social movements are really one of the heavily researched fields in the social sciences, as well as in area studies. That's in fact something that we should understand. A lot of our colleagues in the School of Social Sciences would be doing primary work on social movements. A lot of the research in many areas of area studies are also related to social movements. It's international relations, I argue, that has not done a very good job with social movements. So there is an element of both organization and spontaneity in social movements. The aims have to be long-term in nature. They cannot be just, short-lived impulses. I don't like this, so I'll agitate. We had severe agitations in this city in the month of December, right? We wouldn't call that a social movement. We shouldn't make the mistake of calling that a social movement. For it to become a social movement, there has to be that spontaneous combustion, but there also has to be a steady supply of the fuel, which is provided by organization. So the spark, the spontaneity has to be there, but there also has to be a regular supply of fuel so that something continues. That is organizational in nature. It's not situational groupings either. These have to be some form of sustained association. There has to be, in that sense, typically in a social movement, there is always a core group. Sometimes there's a very well-defined leadership as well, but there needn't be. Even if there isn't a leadership, there is a core group. Social movements are cyclical in nature. And there are two types of cycles that typically afflict social groups. One is a cycle that is internal to the group dynamics itself, in terms of a social movement. In that there's a process by which mobilization begins. It usually begins because there has been some very specific episode that makes people coalesce. There is a period of sustained interaction. Then there is a process invariably of bureaucratization. Because in a social movement, some things have to become routine. Somebody has to bring out the newsletters, right? And newsletters have to come out with a frequency, otherwise the movement dies. So there is a bureaucratic element to it. And then within the life cycle of a social movement, you can have 3 or 4 different trajectories. A social movement could mutate into a political party. A social movement could become a permanent pressure group. A social movement could rupture into 2 or 3 different tendencies, with a militant tendency so there are all sorts of different elements that can go then into the life cycle. But that's the internal life cycle. Social movements also are subjected to the macro life cycle of society itself. By that I mean that at a particular moment, a particular issue captures the public imagination, becomes for a while a very important issue. A lot of opinion coalesces around it. Then, over time, as other issues become more important, there's that external element which also creates and becomes an element in the life cycle of a social movement. And, this is just another way of looking at it. It's about more or less spontaneous coming together. Now, at this point, I do want to spend a couple of minutes on, which is that social movements are intrinsically related to social change. What this means is that you cannot really talk about a social movement in a totally stable social order. If the social order is totally stable, there is no social movement. You have structures and institutions. The very word movement has dynamism inherent in it. And so, it makes absolutely no sense to talk about a movement in a totally static social situation. There has to be dynamism there. So if there are stable social groups with established, unquestioned structures, norms, and values, you're basically saying that there is no social movement there. You need definitely to have the possibility of change. The behavior of members of social movements, there's always a tension between that and the assumptions on which a social order are based. And social movements are also about the faith of people to be able to bring about social change. Now, we must be clear about this. This is also very, very situational and very contextual. There is a very clear temporal as well as spatial dimension to this. At some times, in a particular society, there will be a common sense that change is possible. And at another time, there will not be. Equally, at any given moment, there will be some society in which there would be that common sense that change is possible and others in which there would not be. In fact, in one way, some of the most brilliant political mobilizers are those who are able to tease out, smell out, have an instinctive feel for the moment and to realize, well, at this time, in this particular society, change is possible. So that's a very, very critical element. And it requires at least a small group of people within society at large who are willing to dedicate themselves to the pursuit of a goal at sometimes considerable cost. And that cost may be repression, or the cost may be more subtle than that. It could be a cost in terms of livelihoods lost, costs in terms of family structures strained and so on and so forth, but there are always costs. And that becomes another very critical element in social movements and how they are defined. However, since, as I've told you, what I'm really interested in and what I'd like to propose we should be interested in is how social movements fit within the academic discipline of international relations. I think our focus needs to be not so much on the actions, practices, and strategies of social movements. It needs to be more on social movements as a discursive field. And if we were to try to analyze social movements, therefore, not so much in terms of what they do, how they are organized, what strategies they adopt, but rather in terms of what they represent in terms of ideas and debates, then I think another very different set of questions open up. And here I think I lean very heavily on Partha Chatterjee and his seminal 1983 book on nationalism in colonial context, because Partha Chatterjee comes up with a very, very important suggestion, which is that in any discursive field really operates at two levels that are dialectically related. He calls them, and I will, following him, call them the same, the problematic and the thematic. In other words, in any discursive field, there is a problematic and there is a thematic. And this problematic and thematic are dialectically related. Namely, the possibilities of the problematic have an impact on the thematic and vice versa. What is the problematic? The problematic, according to Chatterjee, asserts the existence and often the practical realizability of certain historic possibilities. So, what is or is not possible at a particular moment in time, at a particular place, those are the sorts of issues that the problematic deals with. So the problematic in that sense relates to the claims of an ideology, its identification of historical possibilities and practical or programmatic forms of its realization. So that is fundamentally what the problematic is about. What is the thematic about? The thematic, in a way, is the justificatory framework of a discursive field. The thematic, Chatterjee tells us, seeks to justify those claims by appeal to epistemic and moral principles. And what are the sorts of things that the thematic focuses on? The nature of evidence that it presents in support of those claims. The rules of inference it relies on to logically relate a statement of the evidence to a structure of arguments. The set of epistemological principles it uses. Also the set of ethical principles it appeals to. So you can see then, in the way Chatterjee constructs it, and I think it's a very useful way for us to view this question, how these two are related, the programmatic and the justificatory. To some extent, what is possible and why is it to be? They go hand in hand. And the best and the most coherent discursive fields are one in which the dialectical relationship between the thematic and the problematic are such that they are mutually reinforcing. Now, how do we bring this down to social movements then? You know, as I see it, this is what it amounts to. In a discursive sense, the problematic in social movements is about what they can achieve, to them are, and what their potential is. And the thematic in social movements lies in justifying why they are necessary, why social change or resisting social change is necessary, and why social movements are fundamental to social change. In other words, without no social movement, no social change. You've got to basically, if you treat social movement as a discursive field, you need to be able to, among other things, make that argument. You want social change, you're going to need social movements. Why? Then you get back to the problematic and you talk about the possibilities that exist. I hope this is not all too heavy, I mean, but that's always the problem with these inaugural lectures. They're either completely superficial or they're completely deep, and I've chosen to go deep, so, forgive me, but I'm sure that the other lectures will be much more lively than this one is. Much more, Let's move on. Second part of what I wanted to share with all of you is categorizing international relations. Now, let us see international relations as a body of knowledge, right? How do we categorize or classify this body of knowledge? What are the ways in which we can do it? Now, in fact, there are three standard ways in which we tend to categorize this body of knowledge called international relations. One of them is by focusing on the different branches of the discipline, which typically, international relations has these three broad branches. You've got security studies, all of its variants. You have international political economy, which nowadays is liberal international political economy, but needn't be, but it is. And then we have a whole bunch of issues which come under the culture, norms, and identity rubric. And these are, in one way in which you can break down that body of knowledge. There are these three broad branches. A second way in which you can do it, and a lot of us are tempted to do it, is to break it down into different issue areas. So there's international relations relating to migration, and there's international relations relating to arms control, and there's international relations relating to epidemics, there's international relations relating to what have you. And since the issue areas in practice are not infinite, obviously, but very numerous indeed, if you try to categorize international relations on that basis, you can get up similarly with just this huge variety of international relations of da-da-da. That's a second way in which you can categorize, classify, make sense of what is otherwise a pretty vast body of knowledge. The third way in which we can do it is by focusing on different theoretical orientations and the variance within these theoretical orientations. So typically, say for instance, the course I teach in SIS at the MA level, on theories of international relations, and I see some of my customers are here, gluttons for punishment. That's the way we do it in that course, don't we? We sort of start off with the high ground that is neorealism, and then do a neorealism and its critics kind of thing, and then we broaden out and get all other stuff in, and so on and so forth. So these are kind of pretty standard ways in which we can categorize IR as an academic discipline. But I want to bring in out here, well, again, some of you who are characters have been subjected to this as well in the MA, but trying to sort of look at it in terms of knowledge constitution, which the German critical philosopher Jürgen Habermas suggested in his book, Knowledge and Human Interests. See, what Habermas suggests, for those of you who are not familiar with Habermas, and I'm sure most in JNU in the social sciences are, but let's just very quickly summarize what Habermas is saying. He says that knowledge is never constituted objectively or disinterestedly. The notion that we constitute knowledge, we try to make knowledge for its own sake, is meaningless. There is always an interest that underlies the creation of knowledge. So knowledge constitution, knowledge creation, always has an interest that is driving it. And Habermas actually identifies these three knowledge constitutive interests as practical cognitive interest, technical cognitive interest, and emancipatory cognitive interest. Now, what is practical cognitive interest? It is the interest in knowledge for the purposes of furthering mutual intersubjective understanding. So, if you are building knowledge in order to maintain or increase communication, if you are in the business of making understanding deeper and broader, then you would say that the knowledge that you are creating has, in Habermas's language, a practical interest animating it. So this is basically creating interpretations that make possible the orientation of action within a common tradition. This first knowledge constitutive interest really speaks the language of communication and possibility. It speaks the language of building bridges. History is a classic discipline that has, Habermas would argue, a practical cognitive interest, because it's about communication with the past. So, you're building knowledge, but the purpose of that knowledge is to be able to enter into communication with people and institutions, cultures that lie in the past, for example. So that's one type of knowledge constituting interest. The second is what he calls a technical cognitive interest. And the technical cognitive interest is interest in knowledge for the purposes of extending control over objects in the subject's environment. Creation of knowledge enabling control over objectified processes. What does it mean? It means I wish to control the world around me, and the world around me consists of other individuals as well, and I wish to need to control them as well. How do I do it? The knowledge that I need to create in order to do that is knowledge that is being animated by, driven by a technical interest. It's an interest of control. So typically, the natural sciences are driven by a technical cognitive interest. You wish to study nature, you wish to study natural processes in order to be able to understand and thereby gain control over nature and natural processes. But again, please, these are not watertight compartments. Please understand that, because evolutionary biology, for example, is as much a dialogue with the past as it is about controlling nature today. So evolutionary biology, you could argue, in fact, even though it is at the heart of the life sciences, is actually not animated by a technical cognitive interest, it's animated by a practical cognitive interest. So one can't sort of be unimaginative here and just say, oh, well, this discipline is obviously this. It isn't. Now, one of the examples I like to give my MA students is that, within medicine, there's a fundamental difference between the training and the craft of a physician and a surgeon. A surgeon and his or her entire knowledge and training is driven by a technical cognitive interest. A surgeon has no option but to see a human body as a physicality that has to be manipulated. There is no option. That's the nature of the job. A physician, on the other hand, is animated by a practical cognitive interest, because the physician has to communicate with the patient, has to treat the patient not as an object but as another subjectivity, and is in that process of interacting with the patient that the physician gets to know what the ailments of the patient are. So in other words, in that same branch of knowledge, medicine, you can see two of its branches actually are, in terms of the knowledge they contain, actually animated by different cognitive interests. And the third of them is the emancipatory cognitive interest. The emancipatory cognitive interest, Habermas tells us, is interest in knowledge for securing freedom from hypostatized forces, which is just social science jargon for saying those forces that underlie our society and give it its seeming stability. Those are the hypostatized forces in our society. The university is a classic example for hypostatizing institution. Because what does a university do? It basically takes the young of a particular age group and creates fundamentally a regimen of learning which involves very clearly established protocols, thereby imparting social stability, stability in young lives, and so on and so forth. So some of the most important institutions in society therefore play a hypostatizing role. And also, the other thing that Habermas is very interested in is the unrestrained communicative exercise of reflective reason, as he puts it. That if what you're interested in is reflective reason above all else, and you wish to be unrestrained about it, without any kind of barriers or restrictions to it, then the knowledge you are seeking or trying to create has an emancipatory interest in it. So this is the language of breaking away, breaking off, breaking out. Any knowledge that involves breaking out, breaking away, breaking off, that is knowledge that is driven by, is animated by an emancipatory interest. Okay, you're still all sitting here, so I'm emboldened. How then does one analyze social movements in the context of international relations? I'm now in the third of the, so you're already in the second half of my, actually well into the second half of my talk, so you don't have to worry very much longer. The first of them is a series of absences. Look, the way I see it, a large portion of international relations knowledge fails to recognize social movements, let alone treat them as important. A large part of the knowledge of international relations, most of realism, for instance, rarely accounts for social movements at all. And these bodies of IR knowledge are largely driven by technical cognitive interest. Any and all interest in social movements is from a problem-solving perspective. And here, by problem-solving, we mean that the social movements are seen as the problem. So, social movements are a problem. We have to solve and resolve this problem. And that is one of the fundamental and, I would almost say mainstream approaches in international relations. The emphasis is on how social movements can be controlled. So that's what I meant with my subtitles, which was, absences, silences, and presumptions. I sort of think that there's a whole branch of international relations knowledge in which social movements are basically absent. Or to the extent that they're present as a problem that needs to be sorted out. And that's the language of control. That's the knowledge created in order to control. Then there are silences. There's another section of IR knowledge that recognizes the existence of social movements, but views them in very constricted circumstances. These bodies of international relations knowledge are driven by a practical cognitive interest, fundamentally about building bridges between a system of sovereign states and a world capitalist system. And most studies in international political economy, I'll suggest, fall into this category. That's the point I meant when I said earlier that international political economy need not be liberal, but as a matter of fact, it is liberal. And therefore, the whole point is, how do you reconcile the logic of sovereign territoriality and the sovereign state with the logic of global exchange relations? How do you do that? And that is what this knowledge is trying to do. It's trying to build that communication between these two worlds, both of which exist in that same planet of ours. So it's a practical cognitive interest. And there are, therefore, this body of IR knowledge, a series of silences. It's not that they don't recognize social movements, they do. But they're silent about the variety and impact of social movements outside the sphere of world economy and global exchange and extraction relations. So, as far as global exchange and extraction relations are concerned, social movements exist. So yes, they will take account of a miners' strike in Bolivia, or they will take account of movements of information technology professionals. They're there. It's not like they're absent. They're there, but they're silent about a great deal. It's a very constricted focus, and that focus is completely animated by an interest, and that's that bridge-building interest, as I see it, between the imperatives of sovereign territoriality on the one hand, where we are all subjects and prisoners of the states and of the color of our passports, and this world of interaction and exchange on which a world economy is based, a world capitalist economy is based. And this whole bunch of international relations knowledge is trying to draw that bridge. And then we have the presumptions. I think there's also now a considerable body of IR knowledge that is alive to and even celebrates social movements. So, we can't caricature IR and say that there's no part of IR that's social movements. In fact, there is. These are bodies of IR knowledge that are driven by an emancipatory cognitive interest. It's an emancipatory cognitive interest because it challenges, contests, and problematizes the existing international system. Critical perspectives, feminist perspectives, southern perspectives, all in different ways are doing this. But I believe, and I'm willing to be proven wrong, because I said that this is still preliminary work, but I am actually quite convinced on this. They make two very troubling presumptions. One, that social movements are pro-change, and two, that social movements are progressive. And I think both of these presumptions need to be problematized. Because while some social movements are undoubtedly pro-change and pro-progressive change, not all are. And in these presumptions, again, lies a particular ideological view, which is actually in some ways very different from what Habermas asks for. Habermas asks us to move away from those blinkered worldviews. That he calls them distorted communications. That's what ideology is. It restricts your worldview, forces you into a particular way of viewing the world. And emancipation in the Habermas sense is actually breaking out of ideology too. It's the unrestrained communicative exercise of reflective reason. And that means breaking across all structures, including the barriers that ideology itself places on us. So it seems to me that there are then, in international social movements as they are in international relations today, really hemmed in by a series of absences, silences, and presumptions. But I also think that they map out quite interestingly with certain sorts of types of knowledge within the academic discipline. One other point I want to make, which actually is taking this discussion a bit beyond sort of the frame I've given you so far. It's more for them, the oldies out here, we're already, in a way, tied into our ways. But for the young, you really can. See, what I want to suggest is the following. The space for global politics is now increasingly crowded. And the sovereign territorial state today is encountering non-state actors of all shapes and sizes. And here's a thought. Think about it, particularly the young amongst us. States are static. States are static because they are rooted in territory. Imagine if you were a citizen a resident of Vienna in the Middle Ages. You would wake up one morning and see that there's a superpower on the other side of the river because the Mongol army had arrived. They weren't there yesterday when you went to sleep. When you woke up today, they were there. A superpower was on your doorstep. The Mongols are the only real example we have of a state that was not rooted in territory, that was mobile. But otherwise, in general, states are static. They don't move. Right? World politics today, I would argue, is increasingly dynamic. And world politics now consists of networks and flows rather than actors. And I do believe very sincerely that our current body of knowledge of international relations doesn't capture this world of networks and flows. We don't have the vocabulary for it, we don't have the concepts for it, we don't have the mental frameworks for it. So it really involves seeing things in a different way. We need a generation that doesn't use wristwatches to do that, because the generation that needs to look at their wrist every time they want to know the time, in a way, is a static generation. They need to use a device which has only a single-use, single-purpose device, or at most twin-purpose device, tells you time as well as the date. Whereas you now need to have a notion of devices that can do a lot of tasks simultaneously. Okay, I'm literally on the last couple of transparencies, so you can all now begin to breathe easy. What is a future, to my mind then in this context, what would a future research agenda look like? If what I'm saying makes any sense at all, and it may not be, I would suggest that there are 5 elements in a research agenda. If we are really serious about integrating social movements into the academic discipline of international relations, we need, I think, first of all, to research social movements as discursive systems. Not get so obsessed about the organizational structures, but as discursive systems. We need to focus on the thematic, problematic dialectic, both in terms of social movements in general, and also about specific social movements. So are there discursive changes, discursive differences between feminist movements, for example, and environmental movements? At a discursive level, in terms of thematics and problematics. Those are sorts of things I think we need to start doing. Second, I think we need to try to fill the absence of social movements in realism and other bodies of power and security-driven international relations. Begin to see social movements as also having an impact on power and security. Thirdly, I think we need to bring social movements fully into the research agenda of international political economy, international organization, and international law. Fourthly, and I'm, by the way, not saying it's not already happening. For instance, you can't study migration law without thinking about social movements. So I mean, there are already bodies in terms of issue areas where we are already looking at it, but in a more general sense. the sense of bodies of knowledge. We need, I think, to explore social movements in all shades, shapes, sizes, that have an impact on transnational relations of coercion, exchange, and community. Solidarity, perhaps. So, what does solidarity mean in these globalized times? And I think finally, we need to go beyond actors. I think we need to begin to start focusing on networks and flows. I'm done. Thank you. When does a social movement become international? I think we can probably conceive of two types of answers here. One is to say that, in a pre-globalized world, social movements tended to become international when there was some sense that, either sources of authority or sources of oppression were in some ways located outside of sovereign boundaries, and were located outside of sovereign boundaries for not one but for several different countries. So, several different countries simultaneously had a sense that their problems were similar. The way that worked usually was that, over time, social movements that started off, maybe with very different immediate causes, took on different shapes. At some stage, they encountered each other across different sorts of sovereign jurisdictions, and they began to find that they could actually work together. I think in some ways the multilateralization and the internationalization of social life played a role in that. The fact that international organization moved from being purely an organization of states to starting to have non-state elements as well played a role in that. For me, the classic example of this is actually the indigenous rights movement. These are all in some ways very localized movements. They're in some ways extremely different. Even the definition of who's indigenous or not differs from country to country, and yet they have been able to get incredible traction across boundaries. And that is partly because they have discovered a common vocabulary, partly because they have consciously decided to build solidarities. Some of these solidarities are maybe even artificial initially, but over time they then take on an organic reality. Partly they have done best practices, learning from each other in terms of mobilization and so on and so forth. But this, I think, is only one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is actually we are going to all have to look at, which is in a truly globalized world, what is going to happen. In a truly globalized world, in fact, a lot of these initial sovereign boundaries may not even exist or may not even be operative. Then in a way, what is going to happen will be a completely different question. Today ideas can move so rapidly across jurisdictions, across whole geographical regions. So my sense is, I'm the first part of it about what it was like in a world that was pre-globalized or which was globalizing. One can think about a whole bunch of features, but for the future, who knows? I mean, we may be just talking about a completely different dynamic out here. I think in some ways, environmental issues may be one issue area in which we actually begin to see something like this happening. So that's kind of my sense of it. On Surabhi, was it? Sorry about that. So on your question, you see, using Jürgen Habermas is not to categorize movements, but to categorize bodies of knowledge, and how they, in different bodies of knowledge, driven as they are by different interests, how they view movements. We want to get categorization of social movements per se. There are some other very interesting sorts of categorizations. For instance, a categorization by Eberl, who wrote a very interesting book on the Navajo Indians. I think it's called The Peyote Culture in the Navajo Indians. I think we have a copy now. And he basically draws a 2x2 matrix and says that social movements can either aim at individuals or aim at collectivities, and they can aim either for small amounts of change or for total change, massive change. And depending upon that, you get a 2x2 matrix. And he in fact then goes on to characterize the different social movements differently. So social movements can be redemptive in nature or adaptive in nature, or I'm forgetting now. I should know this, but but it's easy. If you just were to Google Eberl, E-B-E-R-L-E, Eberl social movements, And you'll get about 20 web pages on this. So if you wish to actually do an exercise of categorizing social movements, then don't use Habermas. It's not going to help you. Habermas helps say these are bodies of knowledge. What has given these bodies of knowledge, what has made them actually create knowledge in the first place, and therefore, given the interest which has led to the creation of the knowledge, how would they, from that interest vantage point, view social movements, right? See, on the Arab Spring, you asked the question, and there was a question from there as well. You see, the Arab Spring surely is a social movement. The question is it one social movement or many? I think that is the core question. By calling it Arab Spring, are we synthetically giving it, a label which makes it one movement? Whereas, in fact, we have multiple movements there. I'm hesitating to say anything with an expert like Professor Ramakrishnan sitting right here, who knows this stuff like the back of his hand. I'm sure he'll be speaking about that in his lecture tomorrow. To some extent, that's the question, because they were clearly all of them, whether it was in Tripoli, or in Benghazi, or in Alexandria, or in Cairo, or in Damascus. These are all social movements, no doubt about that. They are sustained. They haven't just died away. You can even see life cycles in them, how they've arisen, etc., etc. You can see that. But they're actually in some ways such different histories also, and I think one of the dangers about giving it a label like that, Arab Spring, it's like the Prague Spring. These are labels coined by the West for certain geopolitical purposes. And we should use these labels very carefully, because it's very difficult to use a label and then not buy into the meaning that is inherent in it. My biggest problem with the notion of Arab Spring is not the notion of the spring. I do believe it's a spring in a way. And you can see that. It's authentic, it's there in the lived experiences of millions of common people. So there is a spring element to it. I'm just not sure that it's one single movement. I mean, I actually believe that they are very distinct dynamics, and we need to try to understand them in a separate way. So I hope that sort of answers the question, and that may probably explain also why the outcomes are different. Why it would be futile for us to expect a similar outcome. Just as, well, think about an example which has nothing to do with social movements at all, but it would be futile for us to say that, well, just as when military rule finished in Bangladesh and electoral politics began in Bangladesh and civilian governments started handing power to civilian governments, now that it's beginning to happen in Pakistan, it will follow the same trajectory. It won't. Because Bangladesh and Pakistan are different political communities, different political societies. But some things will be interesting and will be common. For instance, the notion of a caretaker government is a notion from Bangladesh that is now being imported into the Pakistani political system. So, one has to sort of be a bit sort of, how can I say, a bit light-footed, when one deals with these concepts, and not get too tied into otherwise the meanings that are inherent in these concepts. On Nawaz's question on sort of the domestic-international dichotomy, you see the domestic-international dichotomy is, I've always maintained, a very useful starting point to teach international relations theory to a student who doesn't know international relations theory. But one of the problems is some students learn that so well that that becomes their pillar and their anchor for the rest of their days, and that's dangerous. So I mean, you start off by understanding that if you were to dichotomize international and domestic, certain very interesting consequences flow from that. And there's just theoretical implications. And those theoretical implications are worthy of our understanding them. But then we need to get out of that and say, well, to what extent actually, is the international and the domestic dichotomized? And the answer is actually probably not. It makes much more sense, in fact, to see domestic and international politics as part of a spectrum of politics. So you have politics without any government at all, to politics with totalitarian government. So politics with total government and politics with no government on a spectrum. And then you locate these various types of politics on that spectrum, from total government to no government, 100% government to 0% government, and then you can fit in other categories as well. You can go beyond a dichotomy of domestic and international and look at tribal politics, for example, and say, well, where would tribal politics fit on that, on that spectrum? Where would politics within, say, cooperatives? There's politics in cooperatives, but where would that fit within that? So I think dichotomies are useful, but they're useful only as starting points. I think anybody who just then uses a dichotomy as a way of understanding, particularly theory, I think you're basically cheating yourself. So I hope I've answered your question. Okay, question, and then I'll work my way maybe backwards. I would say the answer really depends on which anti-colonial movement you're talking about. One is you can see anti-colonial movement as something that encompasses all of Asia and Africa, and say that there's a history of, it's a period that sort of carries on right up to 1980, 94 and the end of apartheid in South Africa, So it becomes in some ways a definitional issue. But if you were to sort of, do what I suggest you do, which is sort of see them as a series of movements that may have a family resemblance with each other, but that each of them have very different locational characteristics and temporal characteristics, then I think you can ask the question, which anti-colonial movement are you talking about? Just within our own region, I think we can say that the anti-colonial movement in British India was definitely a social movement. It was a mass movement. It had leadership, it had this, it had continuity, but it went and permeated broad masses of people. I don't think we can say the same thing about the anti-colonial movement in Ceylon, which got its independence just a year after India did. But in Ceylon, it'd be very difficult to sustain an argument that in fact this wasn't truly sensitive. It was basically if anything, it was an elite, a Sinhala elite that had certain understandings about independence, and independence came really as a collateral to India becoming independent. So I think it depends a lot on then which movement in particular you're wishing to focus on. And if you do that, then obviously it's also useful in periodizing movements, a single movement. So you could say that, in 1885, the Congress was whatever else it was, it certainly wasn't a social movement. And then you can begin to ask, well, at what stage does the Congress take on a social movement kind of characteristic? And that comes back to that sort of links up to the other question, which is on movements as a continuous process. My sense out here is the following: that how do you mark and say, well, a movement begins out here, because some movements are very, very long lasting. The gay rights movement, for example, has a history of now 150 years. Women's empowerment movements, you could say, have a history of a century and a half, 2 centuries. So you could argue, well, when does it begin? When would you mark the beginning to be? I think that is where one needs to get beyond mere theorization and start actually doing studies that have a certain sort of anthropological nature. You've got to do ethnographies of movements. You need to look at movements, you need to try to trace their life cycles and histories, look at what the flexion points are, at what moment were certain decisions taken that led to one outcome rather than to another. This is where you've got to creatively play with a certain amount of counterfactuals as well in history. This is where a number of other elements come into the picture. You've got to ask what the social bases of support were. Did the social basis of support change over time? If they did, what were the reasons for that? Did it have something to do with the nature of the social change itself? Or was it that in some ways the orientation and purpose of a movement changed, and with that it began to get different adherents who had earlier not been attracted to the movement? That a series of questions of this nature have to be asked. You also need to ask, when you're looking at a movement of very long duration, whether in fact it makes sense to treat it as one single movement. Or whether in fact you should say that this was substantially a new movement which saw its heritage in an earlier movement. But in a way, it makes much more analytical sense to treat it as a new movement. So this is where the judgment of a scholar comes in, and for that, to exercise that scholarly judgment, you do need to be able to look at a movement at a certain degree of closeness, and that is one of the things that I'm arguing international relations as an academic discipline hasn't done. And it's not that there aren't movements that have had a huge impact on international relations. There are. I mean, the disarmament movement, for example, is a classic example of a movement that has had massive impact on security studies itself. But we don't really see any good studies in international relations There are some. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it. There's David Courtwright, who's written a wonderful book called Peace Works, which is really analyzing the peace movement in the United States. And he links it to international relations. So I don't want to say there's absolutely no work. That would be wrong to do. But on the whole, it hasn't happened. On the question that Ramanujan, you asked on history, look at Habermas in the following way. It's simple, I mean, just in plain English. Ask the question, why was this knowledge created? What was the interest that creation of this knowledge served? So if you're arguing that is all history necessarily about communication with the past, well, answer is of course not. You could use history. History has been used all the time for control operations, hasn't it? Don't we use history in order to justify what we are doing today? Don't we invoke the lessons of history? And now, you could be using history in a very, in that sense, technical and instrumental way in order to build knowledge, in order to justify the exercise of some sort of control. That's perfectly possible. But you can use history just as easily not to communicate with the past, but to further some sort of emancipatory cause. You know, now the point is that's why it doesn't make sense to characterize a discipline as being one or the other. But you need to really ask, well, bodies of knowledge that exist within a discipline, what has given rise to them? You know, what is the interest that animates them? Once you accept that basic point that even in mathematics, there's an interest behind it. Even a discipline as pure as mathematics, you know, that there is an interest behind it. If you don't accept that position, then of course you have a different understanding of knowledge. But that would not be a Habermasian understanding of knowledge. Habermas would argue that there's always an interest behind it. You need to figure out what that interest is. Okay? There's one question on the network society and states. Well, I could give you a simple answer and say I'm waiting for your PhD to be complete to know an answer to that question, but I won't fob you off like that. It's a good question that you ask. See, states are the ultimate survivors. States are durable. States last. States transform themselves. You know, new states get created, but states rarely die. If you actually were to look at, you know, if you say treating 1648 as that notional date when the Westphalian system began, and you ask how many states since 1648 in the 3.5 centuries have actually been extinguished, it's a very short list. It's a very short list. States survive. So, when I say states are static and we now need to look at sort of international relations as flows and all the rest, I'm not for a moment saying that states may not be able to, you know, also adapt themselves to those flows and networks. Perfectly likely that states would be able to do so. Don't forget that, you know, one of the most important changes that has taken place in international relations, I was actually talking about this to my MA students today, so it's still fresh in my mind, is regional integration processes. That old Palmerston dictum, you know, that states don't have permanent friends and enemies, they only have permanent interests. Where does it exist today? Today, states have permanent friends. That's what regional integration is about. Permanent friendship with your neighbors. But that note is seen by states as being a permanent interest. Are you getting the point? So in a way, it's not just Palmerston turned upside down. It's that the whole, you know, this is completely taken apart. They say, yeah, well, states have permanent interests, but being permanent friends is a permanent interest. So there. So I'm just giving this as an example. I mean, I think, I'm not for a moment trying to say that this new network society is going to lead to the extinguishing of states. Not at all. But we are so early in the game right now that we don't know what way it's going to go. That's the point I'm trying to make. That, you know, this is where, you know, it requires a different mental apparatus to be able to do that kind of work. And an earlier generation is unlikely to have that mental apparatus because they just simply are ingrained in different modes of thought. And modes of thought and modes of being, as you know, go hand in hand. So it does require, in that sense, I think very sincerely, I'm not saying it because there are so many students here and I must come arguing them or something, I mean it very sincerely. You need to have, you know, to get those new modes of thought, you need in some ways different new modes of being. And it's much more likely that those modes of being will be there in a younger generation than they will be in somebody, you know, who's been around already. But that's the sense in which I was talking about that. Okay?